How did Steve Jobs work? This is a big brain, by the way. His brain, because many people consider him a genius. And so I asked the question, what exactly makes him this genius that essentially changed the world? Which is why I decided to reread 531 pages of his autobiography. And in this video, I simply want to share my findings to truly understand what made Steve Jobs this genius with a big brain. And in order to break down the genius of Steve Jobs, here is what we're going to discuss in this video. Steve Jobs' principles, his failures, his achievements, his many paradoxes, his very interesting taste, key figures in his life, and the initial conditions that allowed Steve Jobs to eventually become the genius that we know today. But before we try to dissect the genius of Steve Jobs, I want to quickly explain the why behind this video. See, I believe that we live on a spectrum. On one side, there is create, excuse the horrible handwriting, and on the other side, there is consume. I believe that most of us spend our time here, while all the magic happens on this side. And I kind of have this vision, this idea. What if everyone spends more time on this side of the spectrum, spend more time creating? And I try to solve this problem by making creative videos on how to use your digital devices to create instead of consume. What I didn't realize is that it just doesn't work. No one's interested in seeing that. But what I do think is that people want to hear stories of some of the world's biggest creators, the people that truly have built stuff. And with this video, I simply want to highlight the act of creation and highlight how important it is to prioritize creation over consumption. I think stories like these will inspire thousands of others to create instead of consume. That said, let's start off with discussing the initial conditions that allowed Steve Jobs and Apple to simply happen. Because had Steve Jobs been born even 20 to 30 years earlier, none of this would have been possible. All right, let's lay some foundation by talking about the initial conditions of Steve Jobs. And the question I'm trying to answer here is, what were the conditions that made it possible for a genius like Steve Jobs to happen? And the first thing that you should note is the computer revolution. See, Steve Jobs was born in 1955. In Steve Jobs' teenage years, Intel developed the microprocessor. And this allowed computers to not be these big, bulky things, but be stationary devices that would fit in any ordinary person's home. Had he been born 10 years earlier or 10 years later, there's a very big chance that he would have missed this revolution. Then, next up is his location. He grew up in Silicon Valley, and at the time, Silicon Valley was the home to lots of engineers and employees of HP. So I would say he didn't just live near technology, he had access. He had direct access to it. And he exercised that access. I have to share this story. So Steve Jobs was building a frequency counter and he needed some parts, I believe. So this is what he did. He needed some parts that HP made, so he picked up the phone and called the CEO. Back then, people didn't have unlisted numbers. So I looked up Bill Hewlett in Palo Alto and called him at home. And he answered and chatted with me for 20 minutes. He got me the parts, but he also got me a job in the plants where they made frequency counters. Jobs worked there the summer after his freshman year at Homestead High. My dad would drive me in the morning and pick me up in the evening. So yeah, if he wasn't in Silicon Valley, none of this wouldn't have happened. So the third initial condition is Steve's father. At a very young age, his father instilled in him the belief that he should really take care of both the inside and outside of the product. So The specific story I'm referring to is of them building a fence and also taking care of the inside of the fence, which I will cover later in this video. But just know, his father made sure that Steve took care of the full product and not only that what is visible. But besides a father, he also had a best friend, Steve Wozniak, also known as the Woz. And I would again say that without Steve Wozniak, Apple would simply not have been possible. Steve Jobs was the one that came up with ideas, and Steve Wozniak was the one who would execute them. And this was, by the way, early on in their career, when they were still young. So essentially, Steve Jobs had, at a very young age, access to top-tier engineering talent as his best friend. Steve Wozniak was the guy that made stuff, while Steve Jobs was the guy that sold stuff. And that's what made Apple. That's what allowed them to build Apple in their garage. And I would say that without this best friend, again, Apple would likely not have been what it is today. Now, with these 4 initial conditions, I have a question. What are our initial conditions? Because reading all these really made me think, what are the initial conditions of our times? For one, obviously we have AI. We have intelligence at tap. Intelligence is abundant. Secondly, we are able to essentially reach every single person on Earth, which is also a very important initial condition for modern day greatness. Thirdly, what I came up with is there is a very low barrier to create. It is not hard to produce good stuff. And I'm not even referring to AI slop. I'm also referring to us being able to record top-tier videos with just an iPhone and a microphone. And 10 years ago, that simply was not possible. You would need heavy camera equipment, expensive gear, and lots of compute. And the last initial condition that I came up with is there is zero distribution cost. You can simply post something for free on social media, and if the post does well, reach millions of people for $0. But I'm curious to know, what do you think are initial conditions that allow modern day greatness to happen before we move on to achievements? Something to think about. Note it in the comments. I think it's important, in order to understand Steve Jobs, is to look at what he has achieved. And by first looking at his achievements, I think we can easily reverse engineer the journey towards attaining the achievements. The first big and major achievement Steve Jobs had is the Apple II. And the Apple II is what allowed everyone to own a computer at home. It was the first breakthrough personal computing device fully packaged in something you could buy and store in your home. See, before the Apple II, computers were for hobbyists. You had to buy parts, assemble parts, and then put everything together. But the Apple II, it came as one good package to essentially just plug in and use. That was at that time never seen before. And then, during one of his side quests, Steve Jobs revolutionized animation at Pixar. And this wasn't a smooth ride. They had to kill their hardware, but we will get into that later. But what they ended up building is revolutionary animation. We all know and love the movie Toy Story. That happened thanks to Steve Jobs at Pixar. And the craziest thing is, it doesn't even stop there. Because achievement number 3, excuse me. Music, sorry for the bad handwriting once again, music in your pocket. What Steve Jobs with the iPod is once again very revolutionary. I think you've heard the catchphrase before, 1,000 songs in your pocket. Again, one of his biggest achievements in terms of impact he has had in the world. And of course, number 4, everyone is aware of this one. We are all hooked to this device. The smartphone revolution. I mean, at the time, before 2007, 2008, everyone had cell phones, but none had a smartphone. There was the BlackBerry, which had a keyboard. It worked, but it wasn't as smooth as the iPhone. However, the craziest thing that the iPhone allowed to happen isn't even the iPhone itself. It's this. The app economy. See, thanks to the app economy, thousands of millionaires spawned in essentially overnight. Without the iPhone, this wouldn't have happened. We wouldn't have had WhatsApp, Facebook, Instagram. And I think these 5 are some of Steve Jobs' most important achievements throughout his full career. So now that we've covered his achievements, I think it's very important to look at some key figures in his life. Because Steve Jobs is only the sum of the people he spent most of his time with. And now for the spheres of influence, the people that made Steve Jobs who he is. Let's start off with this one. I bet you have no idea who this is. Well, this is Robert Friedland, and he gave Steve Jobs a gift which he ended up using for the rest of his life. Robert Friedland gave Steve Jobs his charisma. See, Robert Friedland taught him that conviction is everything. The only thing you have to do is to give people conviction, to make them believe. And then reality itself will adjust. That's how it kind of worked in his brain. And one thing that came with this reality distortion field is his famous stare. As you can see, his very intense stare, also on the back of the book, was actually thanks to this guy, Robert Friedland. And by the way, this is how the reality distortion field is described in the book. In his presence, reality is malleable. He can convince anyone of practically anything. It wears off when he's not around, but it makes it hard to have realistic schedules. Then the book continues to put this into practice. Wozniak, who was as congenially honest as Steve Jobs was tactical, marveled at how effective it could be. His reality distortion is when he has an illogical vision of the future, such as telling me that I could design the breakout game in just a few days. You realize that it can be true, but he somehow makes it true. But then, he also believed that the reality distortion field was empowering. It enabled Jobs to inspire his team to change the course of computer history with a fraction of the resources of Xerox or IBM, which were the big computer players at that time. It was a self-fulfilling distortion. At the root of the reality distortion was Jobs' belief that the rules didn't apply to him. He had some evidence for this. In his childhood, he had often been able to bend reality to his desires. Rebelliousness and willfulness were ingrained in his character. He had the sense that he was special, a chosen one, or an enlightened one. And he got that gift from this guy, Robert Friedland. And the next person to be, of course, a massive influence to Steve Jobs is obviously his dad, Paul Jobs. And I think the best way to explain his influence is by telling the story of his carpentry. So there was a discussion about making the inside of the Mac as beautiful as the outside. And in this discussion, Jobs got a bit heated. He reacted typically. I want it to be as beautiful as possible, even if it's inside the box. A great carpenter isn't going to use lousy wood for the back of a cabinet, even though nobody is going to see it. In an interview a few years later, after the Macintosh came out, Jobs again reiterated that lesson from his father. When you're a carpenter making a beautiful chest of drawers, you're not going to use a piece of plywood on the back, even though it faces the wall and nobody will ever see it. You know it's there, so you're going to use a beautiful piece of wood on the back. For you to sleep well at night, the aesthetic, the quality has to be carried all the way through. And that, in one paragraph, explains the influence that his dad has had on him. The next person is, of course, the world famous Johnny Ive. And I wouldn't personally say that Johnny Ive had a direct influence on Steve Jobs and that he made Steve Jobs who he is, but what he did bring to Steve Jobs is a true design collaborator. And I think this is really highlighted in how Steve Jobs describes his relationship with Johnny Ive on page 315. The difference that Johnny has made, not only at Apple but in the world, is huge. He is a wickedly intelligent person in all ways. He understands business concepts, marketing concepts. He picks stuff up just like that, click. He understands what we do at our core better than anyone. If I had a spiritual partner at Apple, it's Johnny. Johnny and I think of most of the products together and then pull others in and say, hey, what do you think about this? He gets the big picture as well as the most infinite small details about each product. And he understands that Apple is a product company. He's not just a designer. That's why he works directly with me. He has more operational power than anyone else at Apple except me. There's no one who can tell him what to do or to butt out. That's the way I set it up. Unfortunately, Johnny Ive no longer works at Apple, but part of his design philosophy is still alive at Apple. Sure, it would have been different if he was still at Apple, but I think he left a legacy. So yeah, that's Johnny Ive. A massive influence on Steve Jobs. The next guy, though, wasn't even an influence. He was an absolute necessity. I am, of course, talking about the Woz, Steve Wozniak. See, the partnership they had, how would I describe it? Without their partnership in Steve's garage, there will be no trillion-dollar version of Apple. And the way I would like to describe that partnership is again through a story. And I think this story perfectly describes how their relationship just fit perfectly. They were building and selling a blue box, which was a device which allowed you to essentially call everyone in the United States for free. The partnership paved the way for what would be a bigger adventure together. If it hadn't been for the blue boxes, there wouldn't have been an Apple, Jobs later reflected. I'm 100% sure of that. Woz and I learned how to work together, and we gained the confidence that we could solve technical problems and actually put something into production. They had created a device with a little circuit board that could control billions of dollars worth of infrastructure. You cannot believe how much confidence that gave us. Woz came to the conclusion it was probably a bad idea selling them, but it gave us a taste of what we could do with my engineering skills and his vision. So yeah, Steve Wozniak was an absolute necessity for what Steve Jobs would eventually become. So how did Steve Jobs translate his belief system in order to be understood by the masses? Well, he got help from this guy. This is Lee Clow, and he was the creative director, I believe, of the main advertising agency that Apple worked with. It's called TBWA Chiat Day. Anyway, Steve Jobs, together with this guy, are the masterminds behind the 1984 television campaign and the Think Different campaign, which essentially saved Apple. Lee Clow, I would say, was Steve Jobs' sparring partner for translating his vision to viable marketing campaigns to be seen by the masses. The next guy, by the way, is often overlooked, but he was one of Steve Jobs' personal heroes. It is Edwin Land of Polaroid. And to understand how he influenced Steve Jobs, I again want to read you this passage. So Steve Jobs said, I always thought of myself as a humanities person as a kid, but I liked electronics. Then I read something that one of my heroes, Edwin Land of Polaroid, said about the importance of people who could stand at the intersection of humanities and sciences, and I decided that's what I wanted to do. So essentially, it is this guy who influenced Steve Jobs to create tools for the creative human being, for the person who wants to create. And me personally, I find this very overlooked. Not many people talk about what kind of influence Edwin Land had on Steve Jobs. So I guess I'll have to read the biography or autobiography of Edwin Land. Let's move on. So after talking about some of the positive stuff, like his achievements and his positive influences, I think it's only appropriate to mention his failures. So number one, Steve Jobs got ousted from Apple, the company he founded. And I wouldn't necessarily call this a real failure because it brought him back to Apple in ways we could have never imagined. However, I do think this event showed that Steve Jobs had a nasty management style. He simply wasn't a nice person if you didn't deliver work that was up to his quality standards. And this failure of him being ousted from Apple led to Next. Again, in hindsight, Next isn't really a failure. However, in the moment, considering that Steve Jobs has been kicked out from Apple and is now building a completely new company from scratch, Next was a failure. The hardware didn't sell and the software was the only thing of value that he created. And the issue is he poured millions into the hardware and it ended up being essentially useless. So through that frame, Next was a failure. But of course, looking at the bigger picture, it only brought him where he needed to be, back at Apple. And another very unfortunate failure Steve Jobs delayed his cancer treatment until his death was inevitable. See, the issue is, as I picked up from the book, he had banned reality so many times that he thought he could will out cancer from his body. And he did this through very excessive diets, like a clean juice diet, carrot juice diet. I don't remember what types of diets they were, but I do remember that these diets were very extreme. And eventually that led to him not being able to be treated for the cancer he had. And it feels wrong to call this a failure, but it should be mentioned that in no way was he the perfect entrepreneur. He did make mistakes, which is why I added this one to the list. Failure number 4 is his mixed legacy. Of course, he's known as this genius entrepreneur, but some people that knew him wouldn't classify him as being that. So for one, he has abandoned his first daughter, Lisa. I believe they eventually fixed his relationship near his passing, but I remember from reading the book that one of Steve Jobs' biggest regrets was to not spend more time with his first daughter or to not nurture that relationship properly. And then there is also this story about how he stole from his first best friend, Steve Wozniak. It was a job, I believe, for Atari, and Steve Jobs got paid like $5,000 and he ended up giving Steve Wozniak only a very small amount. And then there is this other story of Daniel Kotke, one of the earliest Apple employees. For some reason, Steve Jobs just did not want to give Daniel stock options, even though newer and less valuable employees were allowed to get these. And this really strained their relationships. So even though Steve Jobs was the big example of how an entrepreneur should be, he has left a mixed legacy. Those were minor failures, but I would like to also discuss Steve Jobs' biggest failure. His number 1 failure, in my opinion, After he passed, the iPhone turned into a massive consumption device. And I've already touched upon this in the intro, but it should be highlighted that if Steve Jobs were alive today, I'm sure he would have put some stops into place to prevent this from happening. And I have proof. So during the release of the iPad, Lev Grossman from Time wrote a piece on it. And he had valid criticism. He wrote that while it's a lovely device for consuming content, it doesn't do much to facilitate its creation. Computers, especially the Macintosh, had become tools that allowed people to make music, videos, websites, and blogs, which could be posted for the world to see. The iPad shifts the emphasis from creating content to merely absorbing and manipulating it. It mutes you and turns you back into a passive consumer of other people's masterpieces. It was a criticism Steve Jobs took to heart. He set about making sure that the next version of the iPad would emphasize ways to facilitate artistic creation by the user. And guess what happened to the iPhone? And then there's also this story on Steve Jobs banning porn from the iPhone. I won't go into too much detail on that, but one thing that really became clear to me is that Steve Jobs cared about how people use their device. He did not want the iPhone to be a massive consumption device. Yet, after his passing, this is exactly what happened. So I think it's safe to say that if Steve Jobs were alive today, he would have never allowed this to happen to the iPhone. And by the way, I should highlight that all of this happened after his passing. So it's not even his failure. It's the failure of Apple. It's essentially the failure of Tim Cook, because he's the guy that's really responsible for how people use their iPhones. And I think this is also important why I share these stories, because these stories really highlight the act of creation and eliminate the need for consumption. Of course, you watching this is a form of consumption, but hopefully this will inspire you to switch from consumption to creation. So this is not a failure of Steve Jobs. It is a failure of Apple. Now back to some more positive stuff. I want to discuss the very exquisite taste that Steve Jobs had. His taste was unlike anyone had ever seen. Apple products just feel good. The packaging, the way they fit in your hand, everything just clicks, if that makes sense. And I wanted to reverse engineer how Steve Jobs got this taste. So the first source that I found that massively influenced Steve Jobs' exquisite taste was Dieter Rams. And Rams was the designer for the brand Braun. And he operated on 10 principles, which I will read out loud, and then we will connect them to Apple's products. His first principle is good design is innovative. And of course, we've seen tons of innovation from Apple with the iPhone, AirPods, MacBook, and iMac. His second principle is good design makes a product useful. I think this one is pretty straightforward, as the MacBook is the go-to for creating stuff. The iPhone has essentially replaced the camera, and AirPods are the go-to device to listen music on. His third principle is good design is aesthetic. Steve Jobs took this principle to heart. I think all Apple products are 10 out of 10 in aesthetics. So the fourth principle is good design makes a product understandable. And the way Apple communicated this is by stripping away everything that is unnecessary. The menu, the home button, everything is super straightforward so that even a 5-year-old could understand and navigate these devices. Then the next few principles: good design is unobtrusive, good design is honest, good design is long-lasting. Of course, we've seen this with Apple implementing titanium in their phones, and of course Gorilla Glass as the glass used for the iPhone. Principle number 8, good design is thorough down to the last detail. And this principle immediately brings me back to the carpenter story of Steve Jobs and his dad. He paid attention to every single detail. Everything was thought out. Then principle number 9, good design is environmentally friendly. Apple still heavily pushes on this by ensuring their products will be carbon neutral before, I believe it was 2030, but don't quote me on that. And last but not least, principle number 10. Good design is as little design as possible. And this closely relates to Steve Jobs' idea of bringing everything as close to one as possible, which I will discuss later in this video. Then, of course, as mentioned before, Edwin Land. I think it should once again be mentioned that he gave Steve Jobs the vision of operating in the intersection between art and science. Right here. So his next influence is, of course, his dad. And I've already told the story of his dad explaining to him that you should care about all aspects of the product. But I think that's the key lesson. His dad taught him to care, not just build stuff for the sake of building, but to truly care about what you are building. Then I want to once again bring up Lee Clow did not necessarily help Steve Jobs on his taste in products, but he helped him in his taste for marketing. See, Lee Clow deeply understood that Apple's marketing should be focused on the expression of their identity instead of product features. So that is how Lee Clow helped Steve Jobs develop his taste. Oh, and by the way, Len just didn't give him the idea to operate in the intersection of science and art. He also taught Steve Jobs to trust intuition and feeling instead of market research and data. Because the thing with Polaroid is, Polaroid was a completely new concept before Edwin Land founded it. So that's where Steve Jobs took some inspiration. He understood that customers don't always know what they want. Oftentimes, you need to show what it is that they want, as Steve Jobs with multiple products, specifically the iPhone. Then, of course, there's Jony Ive. I think we've already discussed him quite a lot, but it should be noted that Ive simply enhanced the taste that Steve Jobs had. He was like a sparring partner. And last but not least, a very unexpected one. The Beatles. And one thing that the Beatles taught Steve Jobs is iterations. So there's the story, I think it was for the song Strawberry Fields, about them doing 50 iterations on this song. And that is much how he wanted to operate Apple. A process of multiple iterations to arrive at the perfect product for him. Instead of one big leap towards a product, 50 iterations, thanks to the Beatles. I think it's important to discuss some very important principles that Steve Jobs operated on. So let's move on. The principles of Steve Jobs. I think the most important and number one principle is the one that he got from The Innovator's Dilemma, which is a book, by the way. The first principle is cannibalization. From this book, he understood that there is one thing that kills companies like the giants that came before him. Think IBM, think Polaroid. There was always a successor. And it is cannibalization. See, one perfect example is the iPod. The iPod was a massive success. Yet, it did not make Steve Jobs comfortable. He understood that the minute he got comfortable, someone else would innovate and cannibalize Apple and Apple's success with the iPod. So what I did, instead of only focusing on the iPod, they did not get comfortable and focus on new iterations of other products, which eventually led to them cannibalizing the iPod by developing the iPhone. And if it weren't for this very important principle, I think Apple would have never came up with the iPhone. They simply would have just rode the wave of the success of the iPod or of the Macintosh. So principle number 2. Focus. So this was after Steve Jobs returned to Apple and they had tens of products of variations in the lineup. He drew a grid. He knew that from the moment he got back that they needed to kill tons of products that they had in the lineup. So he wanted to shift the focus to just 4 aspects. One focused on the consumer, one focused on the pro, then a desktop version and a portable version. And that was all. Those were the 4 aspects that he wanted to focus on. And his third principle show. He understood that market research and market data was not everything in business. What I mean with this principle of show is to simply show, don't tell. Steve Jobs believed that people did not know what they want unless you showed it to them. And he operated on this principle by trusting his intuition over the market data and the market research. He heavily relied on his intuition. And then principle number 4. Iterate. As we've just discussed, this principle is what he directly got from the Beatles. And this principle doesn't just define his taste, it also defines how Apple upgrades its products, which is why every year we see a new iPhone with just a slightly better improvement. It's all through iteration. So this principle isn't only design, it's also how Apple operates at its core. Then the next one, this one is very important. Steve Jobs believed that the journey is the reward. There is no end destination, and he deeply understood that. He knew that he wouldn't arrive at anything. There was no perfection, there was only striving for perfection in his eyes. So the journey is the destination, is one he heavily relied on. Then let's talk about his team. Steve Jobs only wanted to work with A players, which is why I think he could be so mean to other employees which didn't exactly fit the standards of an A player. He wanted the top of the top. And he actually got his inspiration from Oppenheimer and the Manhattan Project, because Oppenheimer assembled a team of Avengers, I guess, to create the atomic bomb. And Steve Jobs got heavily inspired by this and decided that he also only wanted to build a team of A players. And then last but not least, a very unexpected one. Fuck money. Steve Jobs truly did not care about money. And this might sound a bit controversial or unbelievable, but as you read the book, you kind of get to understand that he truly did not care about money. He understood that the world runs on money and that you need money to operate, but he did not worship money. He did not see money as the goal for Apple. He did not care about being the richest man. And there's one story that really highlights that Steve Jobs truly did not care about money. This happened when Steve Jobs was considering a hostile takeover of Apple. And Steve Jobs said to Larry, "You know, Larry, I think I found a way for me to get back into Apple and get control of it without you having to buy it," Jobs said as they walk along the shore. Ellison recalled he explained his strategy, which was getting Apple to buy Next, Then he would go on the board and be one step away from being CEO. Ellison thought that Jobs was missing a key point. But Steve, there's one thing I don't understand, he said. If we don't buy the company, how can we make any money? It was a reminder of how different their desires were. Jobs put his hand on Ellison's left shoulder, pulled him so close that their noses almost touched, and said, Larry, this is why it's really important that I'm your friend. You don't need any more money. So yeah, I truly believe that Steve Jobs didn't really care about money. But there's one principle that triumphs all. I think this principle is that essentially summarizes Steve Jobs in one word. Give me a second. His most important principle is getting as close to one as possible for everything in life, essentially. So let me read you this story. So essentially, Steve Jobs got a private plane from Apple as he was delivering such great performance. And Steve Jobs being Steve Jobs, he obviously wanted to design the airplane himself. So this happened. Not surprisingly, he fretted over how the interior would be designed. It took him more than a year. He used Ellison's plane as a starting point and hired his designer. Pretty soon, he was driving her crazy. For example, Ellison's had a door between cabins with an open button and a close button. Jobs insisted that his have a single button that toggled. He didn't like the polished stainless steel of the buttons, so he had them replaced with brushed metal ones. And we see this principle in lots of products that Apple has designed over the years. So the most obvious one is, of course, the iPhone and one single home button, which was at that time very revolutionary. And then there's, of course, the iPod with not one button, but one scroll wheel, which fully controls the device. And then, of course, there's the concept of not having an on and off switch on all of Apple's devices. Not a single one has an on and off switch. It's just a button. But besides Apple, I also want to bring this back to us humans. See, as a global example, let's take cars. As men, when we tend to get richer, we tend to want to buy more and more expensive cars. A pattern that I keep seeing is that as men buy more and more cars, their quality of life doesn't particularly improve. Instead, they always go back to a daily driver. And usually it's not even the Lamborghini or the Ferrari. It's usually the best driver, the most comfortable one. Let's say the Tesla or the Mercedes. So yeah, that's cars. And besides cars, there is, of course, also women. As men, most men think that they want more women. They think the more women they get, the more satisfied they will be in life. As men, we'll come to find out this is often not the case. This results in more headache, more maintenance, and more problems. And I think a perfect example of this is Dan Bilzerian. He was the epitome of abundance in women. He had tens of hundreds of women at his feet, and yet he eventually returned to one. And there's a lesson there. Often, what we think we want is not the same as what we truly want. We just want one good car, one good woman, instead of a lot of average ones. So, what is that Kanye West line again? I think Kanye was right. And I would also like to talk about a personal example. So one area of my life which I really want to implement this principle in is YouTube. So if you take a look at my channel, there is a bunch of different videos, a bunch of different video formats, and it's a hot mess. And I decided that's going to stop. Instead, I'm going to focus on one simple format. I'm just going to read a biographies of the biggest creators, and break them down into bite-sized lessons. That's all. I think following this one simple format will help me much better in the long term than following what I think would go viral. That's how I'm going to apply the principle of getting as close to one as possible myself. But then I'd also like to wonder, which areas of your life do you think you can use this principle in? I really like to know, so let me know in the comments. Now, after principles, let's talk about the many paradoxes of Steve Jobs. On one side, he was a Zen Buddhist. And this is what he really communicated in his brand, in Apple, in his products. They really have a Zen feeling to them. They just feel calm, minimalist, beautifully designed, and they have a sense of quiet. However, he was also a very aggressive capitalist. He wanted Apple to be the biggest. He wanted Apple to overtake Microsoft, and he wanted everyone to own a Mac instead of using Windows. And he did not always go about that battle in friendly ways. The second paradox is that Steve Jobs was excessively honest, but also was quite a liar. See, Steve Jobs was brutally honest. He was simply incapable of polite social lies. If he thought your design was shit, he would tell you. If he thought your outfit was shit, he would tell you. If he thought your hard work was simply not good enough, he would scream to your face. And in that way, he was a very honest man. But he also distorted the facts, which kind of made him sometimes a liar. For example, he would claim that an idea was his own 5 minutes after dismissing the idea as not good enough. Or the fact that he essentially disowned his first daughter and claimed that there was no way that she could be his legitimate daughter. And yes, that was Steve Jobs. He could be extremely honest, but he could also lie and distort facts, distort reality. Then the third paradox. Steve Jobs was a control freak who also wanted to push creative empowerment. The iPhone, as you might know, is end-to-end, fully controlled by Apple. There's full end-to-end integration. And Steve Jobs micromanaged everything. Every single detail, he wanted full control. Steve Jobs wanted everything of Apple to be exactly as how he envisioned it to be. And he took this very far, by the way. One example that I remember reading was the color of the machines in his factory for Next. Something that most people would deem so insignificant and not even think about. He wanted full control. He wanted the factory to look exactly as he envisioned. Yet, this control freak fully pushed Apple's narrative to be creative empowerment. He wanted all of the devices to be tools of creation. And as he would call the Mac, a bicycle for the mind. And then the last one. When Steve Jobs returned to Apple in 1997, he took only $1 as his salary, which is, in my opinion, a very humble salary for a CEO. Yet, this humble salary quickly dissolved into massive stock grants and, of course, the private plane that Apple had bought him. So to truly understand this side of the paradox, here's the story of how it all unfolded. Willard happily granted Jobs' wish with a Gulfstream 5 and also offered him 14 million stock options. Jobs gave an unexpected response. He wanted more. 20 million options. Willard was baffled and upset. The board had authority from the stockholders to give out only 14 million. You said you didn't want any, and we gave you a plane which you did want, Willard said. I hadn't been insisting on options before, Jobs replied, but you suggested it could be up to 5% of the company in options. And that's what I now want. And that story really does explain this paradox of Steve Jobs. And to finish this video off, I'd like to read a script that really summarizes who Steve Jobs was as a person. Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. About the only thing you can do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. And while some may see them as the crazy ones, we, see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. And this, of course, was from Apple's Think Different campaign, but it really encapsulates Steve Jobs' personality. Because each ad featured a black and white portrait of an iconic historical figure with just the Apple logo and the words Think Different in the corner. Making it particularly engaging was that the faces were not captioned. Most were Jobs' personal heroes. They tended to be creative people who had taken risks to fight failure and bet their career on doing things in a different way. Just like Steve Jobs. And thank you for watching.